The events leading to the Battle of Orsha in late 1943 were shaped by the shifting dynamics along the Eastern Front after the Battle of Kursk and the subsequent Soviet advances. Following the failure of Operation Citadel in July 1943, German Army Group Center began a steady withdrawal across Belarus, trading space for time in order to stabilize its defensive lines before winter. Orsha, situated roughly 200 kilometers northeast of Minsk, along the Moscow-Minsk Highway and the Smolensk-Orsha-Minsk rail corridor, became a key point in these defensive plans. It was not only a logistical hub for the German Fourth Army, but also a critical anchor for Army Group Center's efforts to prevent Soviet forces from achieving a decisive breakthrough toward Belarus's interior. The Soviet High Command, emboldened by victories at Kursk and Smolensk, aimed to maintain offensive momentum through the autumn and winter of 1943. The Western and First Baltic Fronts, under Generals Vasily Sokolovsky and Ivan Bagramyan respectively, were tasked with breaching the Orsha defensive sector as part of a broader push toward Vitebsk and Minsk. The ultimate goal was to weaken Army Group Center sufficiently to set the stage for larger operations the following year. Intelligence estimates indicated that German forces, though entrenched, were suffering from shortages in manpower and fuel, with the Fourth Army fielding around 200,000 men along a broad front, supported by approximately 500 tanks and assault guns distributed among the 9th and 12th Panzer Divisions, as well as several infantry divisions entrenched in fortified belts around Orsha. For the Red Army, the Orsha sector represented both an opportunity and a challenge. The Soviet forces committed to the operation included roughly 300,000 troops from the 31st and 33rd Armies, reinforced by several tank corps equipped with around 800 operational tanks, including T-34s and heavy KV-1s, supported by strong artillery contingents totaling over 2,000 guns and mortars. Soviet planners understood the strategic value of Orsha's transportation network and sought to envelop the city rather than engage in direct frontal assaults, using mobility and concentrated armor to outmaneuver the German defenders. However, the terrain, dense forests, marshy lowlands, and limited road access posed significant difficulties for large-scale armored maneuvers, particularly in the late autumn and early winter conditions when frozen ground alternated with thawed, muddy stretches. The broader geopolitical situation added urgency to the Orsha operations. By late 1943, the Soviet Union sought to press its advantage before the Western Allies could open a second front in Europe, aiming to reclaim as much territory as possible and weaken the Wehrmacht's capacity to mount counteroffensives. For Germany, holding the Orsha line was essential not only to prevent a collapse of Army Group Center, but also to buy time to rebuild panzer reserves and prepare new defensive lines along the Berezina and Dnieper rivers. Both sides recognized that control of Orsha would influence the strategic balance in Belarus and determine the pace of Soviet operations in the coming year. Winter conditions became a decisive factor even before combat began. Sub-zero temperatures at night, fluctuating between 10 degrees Celsius and 20 degrees Celsius, and frequent snowfalls complicated the movement of supplies and heavy vehicles. German units relied heavily on pre-built defensive positions with bunkers, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles, while the Red Army constructed corduroy roads and improvised supply tracks to sustain their armored formations. The stage was set for a confrontation where both sides, fielding significant numbers of tanks and artillery, would commit to a battle not only for a key city, but for operational dominance in Belarus, anticipating that its outcome would shape the trajectory of operations in 1944. The opening phase of the fighting around Orsha began in mid-October 1943, as the Soviet Western Front initiated a series of probing attacks and larger thrusts aimed at breaking through the German Fourth Army's defensive lines. These operations followed the liberation of Smolensk in late September, which had pushed German forces westward and created a salient around Orsha that threatened the integrity of Army Group Center's broader defensive posture. On 12 October, the 31st and 33rd Armies, supported by the 5th Mechanized Corps, launched coordinated assaults along a 40-kilometer front northeast and southeast of Orsha. The initial attacks involved approximately 150,000 Soviet troops, backed by around 450 tanks, including T-34s and a small contingent of KV-1s, and supported by massed artillery delivering preparatory barrages exceeding 10,000 shells per hour during the opening salvos. The German Fourth Army, under General Kurt von Tippelskirch, had prepared extensively for such offensives. The defenses included 3 successive belts of trenches, bunkers, and fortified villages, heavily mined approaches, and anti-tank ditches. The panzer divisions, notably the 9th and 12th, held roughly 200 operational tanks and assault guns, with reserves positioned for rapid counterattacks rather than static defense. Approximately 80,000 German troops manned the Orsha sector during the initial phase, supplemented by Luftwaffe ground support units and artillery concentrations aimed at disrupting Soviet armor during breakthroughs. German intelligence, aware of Soviet preparations, had reinforced the sector with additional anti-tank guns and mobile reserves, correctly anticipating that Orsha's road and rail junctions would be the primary targets of the offensive. The first clashes revealed the difficulty of the terrain and the depth of German defenses. Soviet armored columns advancing along the Smolensk-Orsha highway were slowed by a combination of minefields, deliberate demolitions, and concentrated artillery fire. The forested and marshy terrain forced tanks into narrow corridors where German anti-tank positions and counterattacks with Panthers and Panzer throwers inflicted significant losses. On the first day alone, Soviet units lost approximately 60 tanks, many to well-sighted 75mm and 88mm guns, while German panzer forces suffered the destruction or disabling of 22 vehicles, primarily from concentrated artillery fire and Soviet minefields during counter-maneuvers. Despite these losses, Soviet infantry managed to penetrate sections of the first defensive belt northeast of Orsha, capturing several villages and pushing the line back by 2 to 4 kilometers in some areas. However, German counterattacks, coordinated with artillery and limited Luftwaffe sorties, restored portions of the line by nightfall. Civilian populations in the contested areas endured forced evacuations, requisitions, and shelling as both sides converted villages into strongpoints. The fighting quickly developed into a contest of attrition, with Soviet commanders attempting to grind down German resistance through successive waves of infantry and armor, while German forces relied on mobile defense and local counterblows to maintain control of critical junctions. By late October, the Soviet command adjusted its tactics, bringing in additional artillery to intensify barrages before assaults and shifting some tank corps to flank operations aimed at bypassing heavily fortified stretches of the highway. The Germans, recognizing the pressure on their line, redeployed elements of the 20th Panzer Division from reserves further south to reinforce threatened sectors. The fighting in this phase did not yet produce a decisive breakthrough, but it laid the groundwork for the larger armored clashes that would follow in November, as both sides increased their reliance on tank-heavy engagements to determine control of the Orsha approaches. The initial battles demonstrated that while Soviet forces could erode German positions through weight of numbers and sustained pressure, the German Fourth Army retained the capability to counter these efforts effectively, ensuring the conflict would escalate into a protracted and destructive engagement. Strategic planning for the Orsha sector in late October and early November 1943 reflected both the Soviet intent to sustain offensive momentum and the German priority of preserving the integrity of Army Group Center's defensive network. The Soviet High Command, seeking to capitalize on the gains made after Smolensk, tasked the Western Front under General Vasily Sokolovsky with breaking the German Fourth Army's positions along the Smolensk-Orsha-Minsk axis. The primary goal was to seize Orsha and its rail and road junctions, thereby disrupting German logistics and forcing a deeper withdrawal toward Minsk. The forces allocated to this effort included more than 300,000 men, divided among the 31st, 33rd, and 49th Armies, supported by the 5th and 6th Guards Tank Corps, which together fielded around 800 tanks and self-propelled guns, predominantly T-34 Ta-76, supplemented by KV-1 heavies and Su-76 assault guns. Artillery support exceeded 2,500 pieces, ranging from 76-meter divisional guns to 152mm heavy howitzers, ensuring the Red Army could deliver concentrated fire across multiple sectors. Logistical and doctrinal considerations shaped Soviet plans. Recognizing the challenges posed by dense forests and partially thawed terrain, engineers constructed corduroy roads and temporary bridges to maintain the flow of fuel and ammunition to forward tank units. Soviet doctrine emphasized deep operations, aiming to breach German lines through concentrated assaults and then exploit openings with armored thrusts, encircling Orsha rather than reducing it through direct urban combat. Propaganda circulated among Soviet troops stressed the symbolic importance of advancing into Belarus before the onset of full winter, portraying the operation as another step toward pushing the Wehrmacht from Soviet soil entirely. German preparations, by contrast, centered on a defensive in-depth strategy aimed at bleeding Soviet forces and delaying any breakthrough long enough to secure the coming winter line along the Berezina River. The Fourth Army, commanded by General Kurt von Tippelskirch, had around 200,000 men defending a 120-kilometer front, with the Orsha sector considered the most critical. The panzer divisions in reserve, the 9th, 12th, and elements of the 20th Panzer Division, fielded about 450 operational tanks and assault guns, including Panzer Vs, Panthers, and Stu G3s. Static infantry divisions manned the three-tiered defensive belts, heavily fortified with bunkers, trenches, minefields, and anti-tank ditches, while the mobile panzer reserves were tasked with launching immediate counterattacks against Soviet penetrations. The Luftwaffe committed limited resources as fuel shortages and competing demands on other fronts constrained its ability to provide sustained air cover. Miscalculations emerged on both sides as planning translated into operations. Soviet commanders underestimated the depth and resilience of the German fortifications, assuming their concentrated armor and artillery could force a breach within several days. Early assaults revealed the extent of the minefields and the density of German anti-tank positions, leading to higher-than-anticipated armor losses in narrow attack corridors. German intelligence, while accurate about Soviet troop concentrations, misjudged the scale of Soviet artillery deployments and the speed at which engineers could overcome terrain obstacles, resulting in several panzer counterattacks being blunted by pre-sighted Soviet fire. Propaganda shaped the operational context as well. Soviet broadcasts and printed material highlighted the operation as a prelude to liberating Belarus, aiming to maintain morale despite rising casualties. On the German side, internal reports emphasized the necessity of holding Orsha as a linchpin for the entire Central Front, framing it as essential to buying time for the construction of deeper defensive positions. Soldiers on both sides were aware that the outcome at Orsha would likely dictate whether the front would stabilize for the winter, or if the Red Army would be positioned for a larger push into Belarus in 1944. By early November, both sides had concentrated the bulk of their mobile forces in anticipation of escalating clashes. Soviet Tank Corps moved into assembly areas behind the 33rd and 49th Armies, while German panzer divisions remained poised to counterstrike once Soviet spearheads committed. The stage was set for a series of large-scale armored confrontations around Orsha, as the Soviet command prepared to launch coordinated assaults designed to break the stalemate and secure the vital junction, while the German Fourth Army readied its reserves to contain and counter any breakthrough, preserving Army Group Center's cohesion ahead of the critical winter period. The first large-scale engagements around Orsha began in the second week of November 1943, as the Soviet Western Front initiated coordinated offensives along multiple axes to fracture the German Fourth Army's defenses and drive toward the city. On 12th of November, the 31st and 33rd Armies launched simultaneous assaults along a 35-kilometer stretch northeast and southeast of Orsha, supported by over 600 tanks and self-propelled guns from the 5th and 6th Guards Tank Corps. Soviet artillery, exceeding 2,500 pieces, opened the offensive with a 3-hour bombardment that delivered more than 150,000 shells onto German frontline and reserve positions. The goal was to disorient defenders, destroy anti-tank emplacements, and pave the way for infantry and armor to penetrate the first two defensive belts. The German Fourth Army, with approximately 200,000 men in the Orsha sector, had positioned its infantry divisions in fortified villages, trenches, and bunkers along the first defensive belt. The panzer divisions, 9th, 12th, and elements of the 20th, held back roughly 450 tanks and assault guns, primarily Panzer V's, Panthers, and Stu G3s, to execute immediate counterattacks once Soviet spearheads committed. These reserves, supported by mobile artillery batteries and Luftwaffe ground attack sorties, formed the core of the German strategy to absorb and then blunt Soviet offensives before they could achieve deep penetrations. The initial Soviet thrusts met fierce resistance. Northeast of Orsha, the 33rd Army's infantry, advancing through snow-covered forests and open clearings, breached segments of the first defensive belt, capturing 3 villages and pushing forward by 4 kilometers in some sectors. However, counterattacks by elements of the 12th Panzer Division, supported by concentrated 88mm gunfire and minefields, stalled the advance by evening, recapturing 2 of the villages and destroying or disabling 35 Soviet tanks. Southeast of the city, the 31st Army's attack encountered even greater difficulties, as the terrain forced armored columns onto narrow, predictable routes, allowing the 9th Panzer Division to concentrate its firepower. Soviet losses on 12th of November alone amounted to 75 tanks and an estimated 4,500 casualties, while German forces lost around 20 tanks and 2,000 men, primarily from infantry divisions bearing the brunt of the artillery bombardments. Civilians in the contested areas faced immediate consequences. Many villages were evacuated under German orders to deny shelter to Soviet troops, while others suffered destruction from artillery and airstrikes. Reports indicate that entire communities were converted into strongpoints, with houses fortified and civilians either expelled or conscripted for labor, creating a landscape dominated by defensive fortifications and ruins. The destruction added to the difficulty of movement for both sides, as rubble-strewn roads and demolished bridges slowed the advance of armor and supplies. Unexpected developments also shaped the early battles. Soviet engineers, anticipating heavy resistance, deployed mobile bridge units and constructed improvised wooden causeways over frozen marshes, enabling some tank units to bypass German strongpoints and threaten their flanks. In one sector, a Soviet armored brigade penetrated 6 kilometers behind the first defensive belt before being cut off and encircled by a counterattack from the 20th Panzer Division, which destroyed 28 tanks and captured over 200 Soviet troops. These engagements underscored the fluidity of the fighting, as both sides employed rapid maneuver to exploit temporary weaknesses. By mid-November, the front had shifted by an average of 3 to 5 kilometers in several sectors, but Orsha itself remained firmly under German control. The Soviet command prepared to renew the offensive with additional reinforcements, while German forces continued to cycle their panzer reserves to threatened areas. The first week of major combat demonstrated that while Soviet numerical superiority in tanks and artillery could achieve localized gains, German defensive depth and mobile counterattacks could prevent a rapid breakthrough, ensuring the battle would escalate into a prolonged contest marked by continuous armored clashes and attritional tactics. Through the latter half of November 1943, the fighting around Orsha intensified into a series of escalating engagements as the Soviet Western Front committed additional forces to expand its gains, while the German Fourth Army concentrated its reserves to stabilize the sector. Between 16 and 22 November, Soviet commanders ordered the 31st, 33rd, and 49th Armies to mount renewed assaults along the Smolensk-Orsha highway and adjacent sectors, deploying over 200,000 troops supported by approximately 700 tanks and self-propelled guns, including T-34s, KV-1 heavies, and Su-85s. Artillery support remained substantial, with more than 2,000 guns and mortars delivering barrages exceeding 120,000 shells per day during peak operations. The objective was to overwhelm the layered German defenses, seize control of Orsha's road and rail hubs, and create the conditions for a winter advance deeper into Belarus. The German Fourth Army, holding roughly 190,000 troops in the Orsha region, relied on a combination of fortified belts, mobile reserves, and tactical counterattacks to contain the offensive. The panzer divisions, which together fielded around 400 operational tanks and assault guns, remained the primary striking force, launching repeated counterblows against Soviet penetrations. The 9th Panzer Division, positioned along the southern flank, conducted two significant counterattacks during this period, each involving 40 to 50 tanks supported by infantry and artillery, which successfully recaptured several strongpoints and stalled Soviet advances by as much as 4 kilometers. Luftwaffe. Ground attack aircraft, though constrained by limited fuel and winter weather, flew targeted sorties against Soviet assembly areas and supply routes, inflicting additional delays. Terrain and weather exacerbated the difficulties for both sides. Persistent snowfall and temperatures ranging from 10 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius hardened the ground, allowing tanks to maneuver more freely but hampering infantry movement through waist-deep snow in forested sectors. Supply lines for the Red Army became increasingly strained as improvised roads froze, broke under the weight of heavy vehicles, or were interdicted by German artillery. Conversely, German units, while benefiting from shorter interior lines, faced severe fuel shortages that limited the scope of their panzer counterattacks, forcing commanders to prioritize only the most critical threats. Casualties during this week reflected the intensity of the fighting. Soviet forces are estimated to have suffered approximately 28,000 killed and wounded, and the loss of over 200 tanks, primarily to mines, anti-tank guns, and panzer counterattacks. German losses, while lower, were significant, totaling around 14,000 killed and wounded, and roughly 90 tanks and assault guns destroyed or disabled, including several Panthers lost to Soviet artillery fire during countermaneuvers. These losses began to erode both sides' ability to sustain the same operational tempo, with Soviet tank brigades reduced to half their strength in some sectors, and German panzer divisions increasingly reliant on workshops to keep damaged vehicles operational. Despite the heavy fighting, territorial shifts remained limited. Soviet forces managed to expand their control by 3 to 7 kilometers along parts of the front, capturing several fortified villages and advancing closer to the Orsha rail hub, but failed to achieve a decisive breach. German defensive tactics, which combined rapid counterattacks with deliberate withdrawals to pre-prepared positions, effectively blunted deeper Soviet penetrations. Civilian areas in the contested zones continued to suffer destruction, as German forces demolished infrastructure to deny it to the advancing Red Army, while Soviet artillery strikes leveled villages suspected of harboring German strongpoints. By the end of November, both commands recognized the growing cost of the engagement. The Soviet Western Front prepared to rotate some depleted units from the line and bring in fresh rifle divisions, while concentrating remaining tank forces for another concerted push. The German Fourth Army, while holding its positions, requested additional fuel and replacements from Army Group Center to maintain its capacity for counterattacks. The battle was entering a phase where attrition, rather than maneuver, became the defining factor, setting the stage for an even larger clash of armor and artillery, as both sides sought to force a resolution before the onset of deeper winter conditions. By early December 1943, the Battle of Orsha had escalated into one of the heaviest sustained engagements along the central sector of the Eastern Front, as both Soviet and German commands committed additional formations to either break or preserve the defensive line before the deep winter freeze. The Soviet Western Front concentrated fresh units from the 2nd Guards Tank Corps and several newly rotated rifle divisions to reinforce the 31st and 33rd Armies, bringing their total strength near Orsha to roughly 320,000 troops. The armored contingent was rebuilt to around 750 operational vehicles, including T-34 Ch-76, Su-85s, and a limited number of KV-1 heavies, supported by over 2,400 artillery pieces ranging from divisional guns to heavy howitzers. Soviet commanders intended to deliver a decisive blow before the year's end, seeking to capture Orsha's rail hub, disrupt the German Fourth Army's winter preparations, and set conditions for an eventual push toward Vitebsk and Minsk. For the Germans, holding Orsha had become essential to Army Group Center's broader defensive integrity. The Fourth Army, still fielding about 185,000 troops in the sector, relied on the 9th, 12th, and 20th Panzer Divisions, collectively operating roughly 380 tanks and assault guns, including Panzer Vs, Panthers, and Stu G3s. Infantry divisions manned the extensive fortified belts, while the mobile panzer elements were tasked with delivering counterblows against any Soviet breakthrough attempts. Heavy artillery and a small Luftwaffe contingent, limited to fewer than 150 operational aircraft due to weather and fuel constraints, provided additional support. German High Command authorized significant resources for the defense, recognizing that a collapse at Orsha could unravel the entire front in Belarus before spring. The peak of the campaign began on 4th December, when Soviet forces launched a concentrated assault along a 25-kilometer stretch north of the Smolensk-Orsha highway. The attack opened with a 5-hour artillery barrage that expended over 180,000 shells, targeting German frontline trenches, command posts, and artillery emplacements. Following the bombardment, waves of Soviet infantry, supported by over 400 tanks, advanced through snow-covered fields and forests toward the first two defensive belts. The initial thrust achieved partial success, breaching the first line in several sectors and capturing 4 fortified villages by midday, advancing up to 5 kilometers in localized areas. German counterattacks, however, quickly blunted the Soviet advance. The 12th Panzer Division, committing 60 tanks in 2 counterblows, struck Soviet spearheads near the village of Baranovo, destroying 28 T-34s and halting the advance along the highway corridor. The 20th Panzer Division, operating on the southern flank, countered a Soviet breakthrough attempt near Shatilovo, regaining 2 kilometers of lost ground and cutting off a Soviet armored battalion, which subsequently lost 15 tanks to concentrated 75mm and 88mm fire. These engagements underscored the efficacy of German mobile defense, even as fuel shortages and heavy attrition strained their ability to sustain such maneuvers over multiple days. The human and material cost of the fighting rose sharply during this phase. Between 4 and 10th December, Soviet forces suffered an estimated 36,000 killed and wounded, with more than 300 tanks destroyed or disabled, many abandoned due to mechanical failures in the extreme cold. German casualties, though lower, reached approximately 18,000 killed and wounded, with around 100 tanks and assault guns rendered inoperable, including several Panthers lost to deep snow and engine damage rather than direct combat. Civilian areas within the combat zone were further devastated, with most villages either depopulated or destroyed, as both sides fortified or shelled them. Despite the intensity of the Soviet push, territorial gains remained modest. By mid-December, Soviet forces had advanced between 6 and 9 kilometers along select axes, but had not penetrated the final defensive belt protecting Orsha itself. German defenses, anchored by well-prepared positions and rapid counterattacks, held firm, though at growing cost. The battle entered a grinding phase in which both sides sought to maintain pressure, despite the onset of harsher winter conditions, with temperatures falling below 25 degrees Celsius and snow accumulation complicating all movement. Neither side achieved decisive results, but the scale of the clashes, particularly the repeated tank battles, highlighted the Orsha sector's role as a proving ground for tactics and forces that would shape operations in 1944, including the Soviet planning that would later culminate in Operation Bagration. Throughout the second half of December 1943, the fighting near Orsha evolved into a cycle of resistance and adaptation, as both Soviet and German commands adjusted their tactics to cope with mounting attrition, logistical challenges, and the severe winter conditions. The Soviet Western Front, having absorbed heavy losses during earlier assaults, rotated exhausted units from the 31st and 33rd Armies out of the front line and replaced them with fresh rifle divisions and 2 reinforced tank brigades from the 2nd Guards Tank Corps. Despite these reinforcements, the total number of operational Soviet tanks had fallen to roughly 600, with many vehicles sidelined for mechanical repair or cannibalized for spare parts. The Soviet artillery park, still exceeding 2,200 pieces, became the primary instrument for maintaining offensive pressure, as fuel shortages and the state of the roads restricted large-scale armored thrusts. Commanders shifted to a pattern of concentrated bombardments, followed by smaller, regiment or battalion-sized infantry attacks aimed at wearing down German positions gradually. German forces, equally strained, relied on defensive ingenuity to offset their numerical disadvantage. The Fourth Army's strength in the sector stabilized at approximately 175,000 troops, supported by around 320 operational tanks and assault guns, mostly Panzer IVs and Stu G3s, with a dwindling number of Panthers due to mechanical losses. German engineers expanded and improved defensive belts, laying additional minefields, constructing new trench systems, and reinforcing strongpoints with salvaged materials from ruined villages. To conserve resources, German panzer divisions adopted a strategy of limited counterattacks, deploying small groups of tanks and assault guns to disrupt Soviet penetrations rather than launching large-scale thrusts. Artillery and pre-sighted defensive fires became the backbone of their response, as fuel constraints continued to limit the mobility of their armored reserves. The psychological and physical toll on both armies became increasingly evident. For Soviet troops, the prolonged engagements and sub-zero temperatures, often dipping below 25 degrees Celsius, resulted in widespread frostbite cases and equipment failures, particularly among motorized and armored units. Supply convoys struggled to deliver ammunition and rations as ice-clogged roads caused repeated delays. German soldiers, despite operating on shorter supply lines, faced similar hardships, with fuel rationing forcing them to rely on horse-drawn logistics in some sectors and limiting the frequency of mechanized counterattacks. Morale on both sides fluctuated. Soviet propaganda emphasized the broader strategic objective of liberating Belarus, while German units were bolstered by internal reports framing the defense of Orsha as critical to preserving Army Group Center's winter line. Small-scale but fierce engagements marked this phase. On 18th of December, near the village of Gnezdovo, a Soviet infantry regiment, supported by 12 T-34s, attempted to seize a key crossroads held by a German infantry battalion reinforced with 5 Stu-G3s. The attack was repelled after a 6-hour battle, with the Soviets losing 8 tanks and over 400 men, while German losses amounted to 180 killed and wounded. These localized clashes, though not decisive individually, accumulated into heavy attrition, reducing both armies' capacity for sustained operations and shaping the nature of the fighting into a contest of endurance rather than maneuver. Partisan activity in the forests east and south of Orsha added another layer of complexity. Soviet partisans, operating in groups of 50 to 200 fighters, sabotaged German supply lines, derailed trains, and ambushed convoys, forcing the Fourth Army to divert infantry and security battalions to rear area duties. While these actions disrupted German logistics, they also strained Soviet supply lines indirectly, as German forces intensified patrols and fortified critical roads, slowing traffic for both sides. By the end of December, both commands had adapted their operational posture to focus on holding ground and preparing for future offensives rather than immediate breakthroughs. The Soviet Western Front concentrated on improving supply networks, stockpiling ammunition, and consolidating gains within striking distance of Orsha, while the German Fourth Army reinforced its defensive network, prepared fallback lines, and requested additional replacements from Army Group Center to replenish depleted infantry regiments. The battle, though still active, had shifted from sweeping armored maneuvers to grinding static confrontations, with both sides preparing for the likelihood of renewed, large-scale operations once conditions permitted in early 1944. In January 1944, the Battle of Orsha reached a critical turning point as both Soviet and German commands recognized that prolonged attrition alone would not deliver a decisive outcome. The Soviet Western Front, under General Vasily Sokolovsky, prepared a concentrated offensive designed to exploit cumulative German losses and force a breakthrough before spring thaws rendered large-scale operations impossible. Reinforcements were brought forward from the 5th Guards Tank Army and several rifle divisions from the 10th Army, raising Soviet strength in the Orsha sector to approximately 340,000 troops. The armored contingent was restored to about 720 operational tanks and self-propelled guns, including newly arrived T-34-85s alongside T-34-76, Su-85s, and a limited number of IS-2 heavy tanks, supported by more than 2,500 artillery pieces and rocket launchers. The plan called for simultaneous assaults along multiple axes north and south of the Smolensk-Orsha highway, aiming to stretch German reserves thin, fracture their defensive network, and seize the city's vital rail and road junctions. German forces, now numbering about 170,000 troops in the Orsha sector, faced mounting strain despite holding well-prepared positions. The Fourth Army's panzer divisions, 9th, 12th, and 20th, fielded roughly 300 operational tanks and assault guns, with their Panther contingents reduced by mechanical attrition and fuel shortages. Infantry divisions, many operating at reduced strength, manned extensive trench systems and fortified villages, but lacked the manpower to cover the entire sector evenly. German High Command, aware that a full Soviet breakthrough could jeopardize Army Group Center's entire central front, redeployed elements of the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division from reserve to stiffen the line, while Luftwaffe units attempted to provide intermittent air support despite dwindling fuel and the challenges of winter weather. The Soviet offensive began on 14th of January with a concentrated artillery barrage, delivering over 200,000 shells across a 30-kilometer sector north and south of the highway over 6 hours. This preparation targeted German command posts, artillery batteries, and known strongpoints, aiming to paralyze coordination before the infantry and armor advanced. Following the barrage, 3 Soviet armies surged forward, spearheaded by over 400 tanks in the first wave. The initial assaults achieved partial success, breaching the first two defensive belts in several sectors and capturing 6 fortified villages by nightfall, while advancing up to 8 kilometers along the northern axis. However, German mobile reserves countered rapidly. The 12th Panzer Division, committing 50 tanks in 2 thrusts, halted Soviet spearheads near the village of Bolshy-Zhilichi, destroying 24 T-34s and cutting off a Soviet motorized battalion, while the 9th Panzer Division countered along the southern flank, regaining 3 kilometers of lost ground and inflicting further tank losses. The engagements of mid-January marked some of the heaviest tank clashes in the battle to date. Soviet tank brigades, reinforced by T-34, 85s, and IS-2s, demonstrated greater firepower and armor resilience compared to earlier phases, but mechanical reliability issues and mines continued to claim many vehicles. German Panthers and Panzer IVs, operating from hull-down positions and supported by 88mm anti-tank guns, inflicted substantial losses despite their dwindling numbers. Between 14 and 20 January, Soviet forces lost approximately 280 tanks, destroyed or disabled, and suffered an estimated 42,000 killed and wounded, while German forces incurred around 20,000 casualties and the loss of 90 tanks and assault guns, including several Panthers immobilized by mechanical failures rather than combat. Civilians in the contested region faced worsening conditions. Many villages were razed during fighting or intentionally destroyed by retreating German forces to deny them to Soviet troops. Remaining inhabitants were displaced, conscripted for labor, or caught in crossfire during shifting battles, contributing to a growing humanitarian crisis in the area. By late January, despite localized gains, the Soviet Western Front had not secured Orsha or achieved a decisive rupture of the German line. The offensive stalled as ammunition shortages, vehicle breakdowns, and the accumulation of casualties reduced Soviet operational momentum. The Fourth Army, though battered, maintained control over the city and the crucial road and rail corridors, relying on its layered defenses and mobile reserves to offset its declining manpower and fuel reserves. The stage was set for both sides to reconsider their operational priorities, as deep winter and logistical fatigue dictated a pause in large-scale maneuvers, even as both commands began planning for the inevitable resumption of offensive operations with the coming spring. By February 1944, the battle for Orsha entered a phase defined by attritional warfare and strategic reassessment, as neither the Soviet Western Front nor the German Fourth Army could sustain the pace of large-scale offensives without risking collapse. Soviet forces, after their January offensive, had been reduced to around 300,000 combat-capable troops in the sector. Their tank strength, which had peaked at over 700 vehicles, had fallen to approximately 550 operational machines due to combat losses, mechanical breakdowns, and the difficulty of resupply in the sub-zero conditions. Artillery remained abundant, with about 2,200 pieces still active, but ammunition consumption had outpaced delivery, forcing Soviet commanders to prioritize barrages for counter-battery fire and critical attacks rather than constant preparatory shelling. The operational goal shifted toward consolidating captured ground, disrupting German logistics through artillery and partisan coordination, and preparing for a renewed push once spring conditions allowed for more sustained maneuver warfare. German forces in the Orsha sector, numbering roughly 165,000 troops, faced similar strains despite retaining control of the city and its key transport corridors. The Fourth Army's panzer divisions, the 9th, 12th, and 20th, could field only about 260 operational tanks and assault guns by early February. Mechanical wear, limited spare parts, and rationed fuel reduced the mobility of these reserves, restricting counterattacks to short, localized thrusts. Infantry divisions, many operating at 60–70% of their authorized strength, held extensive trench networks and fortified positions, but lacked the manpower to rotate units effectively, leaving frontline troops in exposed positions for prolonged periods. German High Command, anticipating a Soviet spring offensive, focused on reinforcing defensive belts, stockpiling ammunition, and constructing fallback lines west of Orsha to avoid encirclement if the front collapsed. The character of the fighting shifted accordingly. Daily engagements consisted of limited Soviet probing attacks, supported by small armored groups and artillery concentrations, aimed at testing German positions, destroying outposts, and inflicting attritional losses. German responses relied heavily on pre-sighted artillery fire, counterattacks by platoon and company-sized units, and the mobility of assault guns rather than committing large armored formations. On 11 February, near the village of Karpovichi, a Soviet assault involving 2 rifle battalions and 15 T-34s attempted to breach a thinly manned stretch of the German line. The attack was contained by concentrated 105 mm and 150 mm artillery fire, supplemented by 5 Stu-G3s and a small detachment of Panzer IVs, resulting in the destruction of 9 tanks and over 600 Soviet casualties. German losses in the engagement totaled 180 killed and wounded, with 2 assault guns disabled. Partisan activity intensified during this period, with Soviet irregular forces conducting frequent sabotage operations behind German lines. Rail lines leading from Orsha to Minsk and Vitebsk were repeatedly targeted, delaying the movement of reinforcements and supplies. These actions forced the diversion of German security battalions and infantry reserves, further thinning the already strained front. However, German countermeasures, including fortified railheads and increased patrols, slowed the partisans' impact, while also indirectly delaying Soviet supply convoys as German forces fortified and controlled the region's critical transport routes. Casualties in February reflected the grinding nature of the combat. Soviet forces suffered an estimated 25,000 killed and wounded, and the loss of roughly 120 tanks, primarily due to mines, concentrated artillery fire, and counterattacks by assault guns. German losses amounted to about 12,000 killed and wounded, with 40 tanks and assault guns destroyed or rendered inoperable, many due to mechanical failures in the freezing conditions. Civilian suffering continued as villages along the front were evacuated or destroyed to clear fields of fire, and food requisitioning by both armies deepened local shortages. By the end of February, the Orsha front had stabilized into a largely static line, despite intermittent skirmishes and artillery duels. The Soviet Western Front consolidated its positions, stockpiled ammunition, and began shifting units into reserve for rest and refit, while German engineers and labor units accelerated construction of fallback defenses along the Berezina line. Both sides recognized that a decisive resolution to the Orsha campaign would now hinge on renewed, large-scale operations likely to resume in spring. The cumulative tank battles, infantry clashes, and artillery duels over the preceding months had eroded the strength of both armies, setting the stage for a larger, more decisive confrontation in the summer when conditions and reinforcements would dictate the next phase of the Eastern Front struggle. By March 1944, the Battle of Orsha had transitioned fully from active offensive operations into a protracted stalemate, with both Soviet and German commands using the lull to rebuild their forces and prepare for the inevitable spring and summer campaigns. Soviet forces in the sector, still numbering about 300,000 men, maintained control over recently captured positions northeast and southeast of the city, but had ceased major attacks due to logistical strain and deteriorating weather conditions. Their armored strength had declined to roughly 500 operational tanks and self-propelled guns, with many formations rotated to rear areas for refitting. Artillery, although still abundant at about 2,100 guns and mortars, operated under strict ammunition rationing to conserve stocks for future offensives. Soviet strategy shifted to entrenchment, strengthening forward positions and planning for large-scale operations that would eventually culminate in the summer offensive, later known as Operation Bagration. The German Fourth Army, which continued to hold Orsha itself and the vital Smolensk-Minsk transport corridor, was reduced to approximately 160,000 combat-effective troops by this stage. Its panzer divisions, depleted after months of repeated counterattacks, fielded around 240 tanks and assault guns, largely Panzer IVs and Stu G3s, with only a handful of operational Panthers remaining due to chronic mechanical failures and shortages of spare parts. German High Command, recognizing the inevitability of renewed Soviet offensives, focused on fortifying existing lines, constructing fallback positions along the Berezina River, and stockpiling ammunition, despite severe shortages of fuel and manpower. Defensive depth became the cornerstone of their planning, as Army Group Center anticipated that holding Orsha through the spring might buy enough time to stabilize the Central Front before the expected summer push. The fighting during March was largely confined to reconnaissance-in-force operations, artillery duels, and limited raids rather than major battles. Soviet forces launched periodic probing attacks with battalion-sized infantry formations supported by small groups of T-34s, aiming to test German positions and keep the defenders off balance. On 16 March, one such probe south of Orsha, involving 2 Soviet rifle battalions and 12 tanks, breached a forward German trench line but was quickly contained by coordinated artillery fire and a counterattack from a reserve company of Panzer IVs and Stu G3s, resulting in the loss of 7 Soviet tanks and more than 400 casualties. German forces, in turn, carried out night raids and patrols to disrupt Soviet supply lines and gather intelligence on troop concentrations, though their capacity for larger-scale counterblows remained limited by fuel rationing and attrition. Casualties during March, though lower than in the preceding months of large-scale offensives, continued to accumulate. Soviet forces incurred an estimated 15,000 killed and wounded, along with the loss of around 80 tanks due to mines, artillery, and localized engagements. German forces suffered roughly 8,000 killed and wounded, with about 25 tanks and assault guns destroyed or rendered inoperable, many due to mechanical breakdowns exacerbated by poor maintenance conditions. Civilians in the contested areas, caught between fortified lines, endured mass displacements, forced labor requisitions, and widespread destruction of property, leaving much of the Orsha region depopulated by spring. The broader significance of the Orsha fighting became clear in its aftermath. While the Soviets failed to seize Orsha outright during the winter of 1943–44, their sustained pressure eroded German reserves, consumed large quantities of fuel and ammunition, and forced the Fourth Army to expend much of its mobile strength in repeated counterattacks. These cumulative losses left Army Group Center vulnerable to the massive Soviet summer offensive that would begin in June 1944, during which Orsha would finally fall as part of Operation Bagration. For the Red Army, the campaign served as a proving ground for coordinating multi-army assaults, integrating new armor such as the T-34-85 and IS-2 into offensive operations, and refining tactics for breaking layered German defenses. Historically, the Battle of Orsha stands as a precursor to the decisive events of mid-1944. It demonstrated both the endurance of German defensive doctrine, which managed to hold critical terrain despite numerical inferiority, and the evolving capability of the Red Army, which used the winter battles to weaken its opponent ahead of larger operations. In subsequent Soviet and German accounts, the fighting was noted less for its territorial outcomes than for its attritional consequences, which shaped the strategic balance on the Eastern Front. By spring 1944, both sides recognized that the prolonged struggle over Orsha had not decided the fate of the Central Front, but had set the conditions for the decisive confrontations to come.